All right, ready when you are.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second presentation in the Emerging Technology series. This one will be on trends in amplified intelligence, intelligent automation, and digital client experience. This is a result of our surveys that we conducted the last couple months with our people in the industry in this area. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'm Jerry Murphy. I'm the Senior Vice President of Research and Consulting, and joining me is John Burke, who is the Chief Technology Officer, I believe.
Yep.
Is that right? And with
Good
that,
morning.
good morning, and we will jump right on into it. Got a lot of slides here. Just to summarize for those who weren't at the initial call, we did survey 20 firms. 7 of them were financial firms. We were across 10 vertical industries. Median employee count was 700. The median annual revenue was 6.3 billion. So while the employee count looks low, in reality, the vast majority of the companies we surveyed were pretty large enterprises, and most of them had, over 2,000 employees. What our study was going through was benchmarking key bellwether emerging technologies with enterprise organizations and developing a maturity model, seeing how different companies compared in terms of their maturity with both adopting new technologies as well as their ability to adopt these new technologies. As I'd mentioned, we did this really we built the surveys first couple months of the year. Then we interviewed people in March and April and May, and then we spent basically end of May and June compiling the results. They're in these 10 broad categories. We are going to focus this talk specifically on the details of amplified intelligence, intelligent automation, and client experience. Now, what do we mean by those things? Here's what our specific descriptions are. So amplified intelligence, we really mean machine learning, computer vision, engineering, the tools and platforms that facilitate that, and any responsible artificial intelligence associated with that. By intelligent automation, we're talking about improving performance or processes, typically of IT operational activities, things like low code, no code automation, use of AI and chatbots, things like that. In client experience, we're talking about emerging technologies that actually improve the experience of end users, whether they be your internal employees or your clients. Now, what do we mean by bellwether technologies? What we mean by that are selected technologies that are ones that indicate the maturity of that total technology area. And again, they're selected, they're not exhaustive. We couldn't possibly have the time or the resources to really look at every single technology in a given domain. We pick typically between 3 and 7 specific technologies as representatives of adoption of technology in that particular domain. The intention here is really a quick and dirty assessment as opposed to a really detailed one, just to get a sense of where people are in adopting those technologies and, equally importantly, being prepared to use those technologies. Now, the way we assessed people's maturity were essentially in 3 broad areas. One is the state of actually adopting those technologies. For any given technology, are you currently using it or being prepared to use it? Second is, what is the perceived value of those technologies? So whether or not you're adopting it, are you believing that that particular use of technology will significantly enhance your organization by the use of that technology? And the third broad area is how your company is prepared to adopt these technologies. And you can see there's 7 or 8 categories here. By being prepared is organizationally prepared. Do you have people there? Do you have project plans? Do you have architectures? Do you have policies? Do you have budget? Do you have a plan for how you're going to integrate that technology with other technologies in your environment? So that's kind of what we mean by sort of, are you organizationally prepared? So those are the sort of three broad ways that we were assessing companies on their abilities to use and their maturity in being able to use these technologies. Now, some of the key findings that we have as a takeaway specifically in these three categories are, when it comes to AI, people mostly have defined use cases for AI. They kind of have organizations for it, but they haven't necessarily thought through what are the key performance indicators on how to use that technology or to measure if that technology is effective. Interestingly, the least mature area is client experience, and that is when you look at a scale of 1 to 4 in terms of people's maturity levels, 1 being unprepared and 4 being proactive in adopting technologies, overall, very largely unprepared. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. And, kind of in a nutshell there, people clearly think client experience is important, frankly, more with their clients than their employees. However, what people are doing in terms of using technology, preparing for it, the actions that they're doing don't line up with what they say as the importance of that area. Most automation today is really focused more on incremental efficiency of what I'm doing now. So, can I do the same exact thing I'm doing, but do it more efficiently? So, instead of handling, you know, 10 widgets an hour, I can handle 30 widgets an hour, that kind of thing, as opposed to using new technologies or automation to actually transform my business in some fundamental way. And the last insight, that we kind of brought up is, when you look at chatbots, there's really a dramatic split when you look at people's attitudes towards chatbots. 50% of people love them, 50% of the people hate them. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And as you look through and peel the onion on that one, it really seems to me the context in which you're using chatbots really matters into whether you think they're effective or not. I don't know if you want to say anything else yourself on that, John, or any of these areas. You're muted, apparently.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I think the chatbot one is a really important one because people are under an increasing amount of pressure to embrace AI-driven natural language processing, artificial intelligence, some things. And chatbots are often considered the low-hanging fruit. But as you pointed out, it's not always a good thing either from IT's perspective or the clients or customers to have them in the circuit.
Sometimes the low-hanging fruit is rotten.
Yeah, exactly.
Overripe. All right. So just to recap for those of you who weren't on our presentation, our maturity model, as I mentioned, you're kind of on a scale of 1 to 4. Here we're saying 0 to 3, but it's basically, if you're unprepared for technology, that means you lack the necessary information to take effective action. You're unaware and you just aren't able to respond. You're basically on your heels and you're just not prepared for things that are coming at you. Reactive is, you have the structures and platforms to react, but again, you're reacting to problems. You can deal with problems, but problems come up that you then have to deal with. Level 2 is proactive, where you do have the platforms and structures and organizational process, but they're really focused on your current issues and you're really not forward looking. And the highest level of maturity is when you're anticipatory. So not only do you have the platforms and organization to deal with your issues today, you're actually thinking about what our new technology is going to do and how might they change my business and way of doing things tomorrow. And let's plan and design and train for those things that are coming tomorrow. And given that, here's sort of our high level summary of where we saw maturity by technology area. Interesting here, when you look at amplified intelligence, you almost have an even split between unprepared and anticipatory. So you've got 38% of the people who are leaning forward, preparing and planning for use of amplified intelligence, and 38% who are not. And then evenly split between kind of reactive, proactive. Intelligent automation, not nearly as good. Really, nobody sort of met the criteria for being anticipatory. We did have 70% of the people that were at least reactive or proactive, but a full third that, by our definition, were unprepared for adapting to intelligent automation. Worst client experience, where nobody was either anticipatory or proactive. Um, 25% were even reactive, and the vast majority of people were really not prepared in terms of um, planning budgets, planning training for their people, uh, organizationally thinking about how I'm going to line up for using this, which really surprised me because everybody talks about clients being important, our employees are important, um, but as you'll see, uh, not so much. Now, when we look at amplified intelligence, now we're going to go through more detail. These are the 5 areas that we really covered: machine learning, anomaly detection, image detection, speech to text transcription, multimodal applications, and conversational AI and chatbots. So these were the 5 specific areas of those bellwether technologies that we asked people about whether they were adopting them. Now, here's how it broke down in the low level in terms of when you look, are they using technology? What's the realized value? Do we have teams specializing and so on? So when you can look here, people seem to have budget, right? If you look at all these things, kind of, they had some use cases for using it and they had budget, but they were much more reactive in terms of using the technologies and having teams specializing those technologies and KPIs. I mean, that's one thing I think I see consistently throughout here, John, is that, people will use technologies, but it's more like, oh, that's a new technology. Let me think about how I might use that. And it's almost like an afterthought of how, how am I going to measure the success of using that technology or not? Here's some of the comments, and these are comments that we received when we were interviewing people on how they were using or what their thoughts are on amplified intelligence. So as you can see here, people are thinking about it. It's sort of exploratory. They're looking at specific technologies, but not all of them. So when you look at these 5 technologies we had there, a lot of people have been doing things like speech to text. I think that's pretty well embedded. But when it comes to some of those other areas, not so much. Interesting on financial, you're actually seeing people using it for things like loan decisioning and for customer service and chatbots. And again, we'll cover that a little bit later in terms of how effectively they're using chatbots.
It may be one of those places where the customer experience piece is taking a significant backseat.
Yeah. And I think that's a very, chatbots is an area that I think it's one of those low hanging fruits that may be rotten fruit, in the sense that the technology's there, people use it, and it's sort of like they'll use it indiscriminately across a bunch of different areas. And what we found in talking to people is, if I'm using a chatbot for a standard activity that I do all the time, maybe like a password reset, rebooting machine, asking me, hey, can you give me the number to this department or that department? So it's something where I can kind of ask you a question and you can give me a standard answer, or you can do some standard routine. people love chatbots for that, because I'd much rather get the answer quickly from somebody than have to wait 20 minutes on the phone to talk to a human being. However, if I've actually got a problem and I do not know the answer to the problem, right? My website is slow. I can't access, I cannot do something and I'm not sure what the problem is. People hate chatbots in those environments because inevitably they'll be asking you 15 questions, and what you want is to talk to a human being, but you'll have to go through 27 conversations with a chatbot before they finally route you to a human being. And people find that incredibly annoying.
And unfortunately, and this is another one of those places where the customer experience piece falls off the table, there's still, in a lot of companies, no flow of information from that chatbot, which has asked you all the preliminary questions, to the human. So they wind up asking you a bunch of the same preliminary questions
I hate
all
that.
over again.
There's nothing I hate more than you go through and answer all these questions, and then the first thing the person asks you is, "Oh, what is your name? What is your account? What is?" And you're like, "I just spent 10 minutes telling somebody that."
So that's a place where a successful deployment of AI and chatbot technology may be an abysmal failure on the customer experience front, because there's that lack of integration and flow, which has to come as a result of thinking about the customer's experience and not about the effectiveness of the shiny new toy.
Absolutely. Now we've got some sort of the details here. When it comes to anomaly detection, quite a bit of using that there. What I found in conversations were a lot of anomaly detection. It was a really great fit for security applications. So while a security bot, automation and security can't necessarily find the problem, if you think about, to me, finding problems in security is sort of like finding a needle in a haystack, but I'm not sure what I'm looking for is a needle, you know. So what anomaly detection can do certainly is it can tell you anything that doesn't look like hay. So a lot of these, while they can't necessarily find the problem, they can certainly get rid of a lot of the hay in the haystack so that they can leave you with a needle and a lock and an old boot. And now it's up to you to figure out which of those three is a problem. But people find that very useful. Image recognition, a fair amount using that. I saw, for example, in banking, you see a lot of that where now the ATM machines, they'll actually, you can just throw your check in there and it'll do image capture, find your information. But if you think about that kind of image capture, you've got a well-defined parameters where you know pretty much where things are on something to capture. I think you're starting to see that in some security things. I mean, we've heard certainly about China, like basically looking at every single one of their people out on the roads with all that stuff. So there's more room to grow. One of the things we find with that kind of visual image recognition is today, even there's still lots of false positives in that space. So there's a lot more room to grow there, but certainly in like check capture, it's working pretty well in that area. Speech to text, that's another one that's pretty well done, and I think we see lots of people are using it. People definitely see the value there, saves a lot of time, and from my perspective, that's an area that's pretty well mature these days. And not only is your speech to text, but you're actually sitting in a quasi related area is then doing language conversion. So like I type something in German, and I can talk to somebody else, and it'll convert it to English and that kind of thing. Although they still sound very robotic, but they're not too bad these days. Multimodal applications. There's a debate here on whether that's valued. Now, an interesting thing I see here is 50% of people using it now, 50% perceive a very big value of this. But that doesn't mean, so when I first saw that, I thought, hey, once you're using it, you realize the value of it. But it would be an invalid assumption to assume that everybody using it are the ones that are perceiving value. So probably at some point in the next few weeks, I may just drill down on the data and see if that's actually causal or anti-causal. Maybe it's exactly opposite. The people using it don't see value there, but it'll be interesting to see that. Conversational chatbots. We talked about this before, right? Big split there. Some people saw it very valuable, very not. But again, I think from my perspective, it's very much on whether you're using it for standard routine things versus problem solving. And I think for problem solving, that's really got a long way to go and showing people that it's got any value other than really annoying people quickly. Now, when you look at the state of adoption here, now these are sort of those last 7 or 8 in terms of organizationally. Generally, people have people and use cases, less in terms of the KPIs that I mentioned, and governance. Those are historically the last areas that we tend to see people become mature in using technology. You can see there's significant. A bunch of people did have budgets and training programs. And in terms of revising their operations and having strategies for integrating it, more than half, but still a significant number of people that have a ways to go there. And strategies, people do have strategies for it. And what are some of the use cases? Again, these are statements from people. Some people don't have it in place, but see the potential. Bad actor trading, that's very much a financial services thing. Card promotions and AI for operations. And we mentioned a little bit of that, like on the security side, where we're seeing some of that. Are there any other areas, John, that you have talked to clients and saw uses in amplified intelligence beyond this?
We see a lot of interest in doing broad text analysis for anybody that interacts with people, for things like sentiment analysis. And that's both about customer satisfaction and about finding out new things to direct their attention to: product development, service development. We also, of course, on the IT side of the house, see a whole lot of interest in applying AI to IT operational challenges, managing the infrastructure, especially networks, and very much especially security, and helping do analysis and correlation across different event streams, the whole XDR space.
And the one other thing I'd say there is when it comes to that, it's less an issue of replacing staff. What I find on the security side is people don't have staff. So it's like, I need this kind of stuff just to be able to handle the stream of security things that are coming on board. It's not like, oh, now that I have this automation there, I can replace 10 people. They don't have the 10 people to replace.
Right. It's to take the place of the 10 people they cannot find.
Exactly.
Or afford,
well, that too. And security people are not cheap these days. Intelligent automation. What we looked at were robotic process automation, low code, no code, and our dreaded AI chatbot. We actually asked about the AI chatbot in actually 3 different areas because it's kind of an intersecting technology in some of these areas. As you can stay here, pretty similar to the other one. Some of the bigger differences is a little less between training programs. There's much more 40% reactive. Whoa, did I pop that forward? Is it going on its own? It's interesting. But you can see here a pretty good chunk of people are reactive, a few into proactive, and anticipatory. Sort of people have teams and they have some use cases, but it's really the strategy and the KPIs are the things that seem to be lacking. People exploring this, thinking we don't have to go through all of these different areas here. Fraud detection, that's a big one for finances in terms of looking at illegitimate loans or like bad wire transfers internationally, things like that. People are using them a lot. Interesting here on emerging technologies, building a virtual campus. This is really the first one I saw that I would call proactive as opposed to incremental, right? Where they're actually seeing, putting out a new network, putting in a virtual interface, mapping a campus with drones. That's really the first one that I've seen that was really what I would call transformative as opposed to just an incremental change in technology. So, I saw that here, which I was really kind of impressed with because transformation is something that, frankly, I don't see a ton of.
And it's also kind of an application of digital twinning, which is a really useful paradigm and way of engaging some of these new technologies.
Absolutely. So when you look at robotic process automation, it is definitely being used. You're seeing a lot of what we I think we've done a session on emerging technology a couple months ago on cobots, where you sort of have miniature robots that are alongside of people on like the production line, where they're doing a lot of the routine things like folding a box, putting something in a box, and things like that. Putting boards inside of PCs where you need very precise fits, putting a screw in a really awkward area on a motherboard, things of that nature. So I think you're going to see a lot of huge growth here because there's a lot of really nice things that can be done. And the nice part about a cobot is it's working next to somebody, but it's not so big that you're worried about, injuring somebody because it's something that's moving tons and tons of equipment. Although there are cobots in those areas as well, but certainly where people are using it, they're seeing a lot of value for it. Low code, certainly there are less than half of the people are using it, but clearly people are seeing a huge value there. And I will just tell you, in my conversations with clients and frankly even IT vendors, I'm seeing a huge emphasis on a lot of development on doing a lot more low code, no code automation of processes. Team specializing. Yeah, people do have teams. People do, for the most part, have KPIs. Governance is lagging, which is pretty typical in a lot of these areas. Many people have use cases, but I think the more esoteric and groundbreaking technology, the harder it is to find what the use case is. Sometimes a new technology is a hammer in search of a nail. Budgets are existing there, but there is a lot more action on, because this I see a lot with technology. It's like there's a very specific use case, but there's not as much thought of how do I integrate that thing into my overall IT infrastructure operations or my overall business processes. It's very largely very one use case specific, and there's not a lot of thoughts of how this thing gets integrated with everything else. One place I see that a lot, John, is in sort of back-end databases. Like somebody will have an app and it'll work really great, but it's on a database. The whole company is standardized on, say, like Oracle 12, but then this thing's on, some other database. And now it's like, okay, do I use this tool? Well, it's doing something really good for me for my business, but it actually isn't tying into what my company standards are for infrastructure, whether that be a network device, a type of firewall, a type of API that I'm using, the scripting language that the thing uses. Everything else we got's on Python, and this thing's on Expect or Perl or something else.
Perl.
I love the abbreviation. What is it? Pathetically eclectic rubbish lister. I can see why they use Perl. Training programs are pretty much there. People say they have the strategy for integrating integration. I'm a little skeptical sometimes of if it's really there. Although, again, this is what people said, not necessarily what they're doing, but they said they were. And the integration automation, people had it. All right, client experience. As I said, I was really surprised at the maturity level of people and the lack of maturity. What we specifically asked them about was predictive analytics, AI assisted knowledge, and our dreaded AI chatbot. Overall experience, and again, this may you may be thinking, wait a second, we only have a couple things in unprepared. How are people unprepared overall? But when you're looking at overall maturity, it's kind of a weighted summing across all of these different areas, not just sort of a summing of everything in one column. But when you're looking at, people are not necessarily sure of what the value is of the technology they're using. We beat chatbots to death as a specific example there. Surprisingly, right, you had a good third of the people that really didn't have teams that were really specializing in that area. A good chunk of people didn't have metrics or KPIs or line items in their budget. Revised operations were, again, significantly chunk of people that were reactive in these areas. Comments here, interesting. Clients care less how it's running as long as performance is what they're expecting. People automate stuff. They're competitive. Building technology for members to help self-basic business components. If you have a few items, self-help checkout for employees, working on integrating programs so people have pertinent info at their fingertips. I know when I see the comments, they're almost like, to me, afterthoughts. Like the conclusion I get in reading a lot of these comments that people have were sort of like thinking about the details of implementing client experience are almost an afterthought. It's kind of the sense I get from it, which again was really surprising to me. So when you look at the state of adoption, 50% using predictive analytics, and interestingly, less than 50% are perceiving the value in those predictive analytics. And I guess the conclusion I get from that, John, is people are thinking predictive analytics are not being successful at being very predictive.
It's often difficult to figure out how to use a new class of knowledge institutionally, but even if they're just getting some value with room for growth, which I think they mostly were the ones who didn't get a lot of value, that's
Right.
something, and it means that they're working it out, and that's a hopeful thing.
Yeah. Yep. AI assisted knowledge work, 50% using it, 33 evaluating it. So half were evaluating or planning for next year, not this year. And a similar split between what the perceived value is of assisted knowledge work. And I think probably similar issues to what you're saying there. I think if you're going to assist somebody in knowledge work, you have to have some knowledge ahead of time, and you got to populate that. I know, for example, Remedy as a tool had a lot of, if you had done something before, if you encountered a problem before, there was a way to put in the database, when I encountered this problem, I did the following things. So at least when you had a problem, you could look in this database to see, oh, somebody encountered this problem and here's what they did to solve the problem. So theoretically, that sounds actually pretty nice. But what you find in practice is people aren't always very good at populate. You have to be very disciplined about making sure you populate what it is that you did.
Oh yeah.
And that's the problem with it. It is populating that data in the first place. It's sort of the same thing where you have a database of, I'm going to diagram like asset management. I'm going to show you not just what an item is, but where it physically is located. And the problem is, some people could argue this, but it's tough to actually automatically identify where something is physically located. So again, if you're starting from scratch and the first time I put one thing in, I do that as a process, that's great. But if I already got 20 years of stuff in my data center, somebody's going to have to take a heck of a lot of time populating all of that information. And the problem is it's a moving target. It's constantly changing. Most data centers are not really static. You're constantly adding servers, adding storage, taking things out, swapping them. So it's kind of nice in theory, very difficult practice, in my experience. State of adoption, we again beat this one to death. So a lot of people are not considering it. I think because they've had bad experiences or they don't have the appropriate use case for it. Teams. 2/3 of people have teams. They have use cases. But here again, very telling, half the people really don't have metrics or KPIs. They're thinking about them, but they don't really have them yet. And it's something that people seem to always put off to the future. Similarly, well, you have 2/3 of people have training, but you have a significant chunk of people that don't have training or budget for people on this, which to me is a little bit surprising when people talk about how important clients are. Similarly, half the people just don't have a plan in changing their operations or a strategy for integrating tools and automation in their client experience. So to me, you can say 2/3 of them have it, but half of them don't have the revised ops, and a third of them don't have strategy. So that's to me a big delta between how people talk about clients and what you're really seeing. Strategy, similar. People say they have a strategy, and again, I kind of, given everything I saw with the previous slides, it kind of what they're doing in terms of planning kind of belies what they say with their strategy. Use cases, people see better client services raising your value to clients and board members. Duh. Well, what are you doing about it? So again, people say, yeah, we ought to, man, if we had good client experiences, it would be really good. I wish they were actually doing more about it. Using AI to automate product testing. That's good. Going from taking human labor minutes to automated testing. So that's good. I'm not sure how that I would necessarily rate that specifically to client experience per se, but interesting points.
I think it's really telling that that one person you're interviewing said, we're not using the output.
Yeah.
And that just really speaks to that not closing the process loop, not doing the governance, not integrating it into your processes. Integrating into your operations. Sorry.
All right.
So yeah.
And with that, I think we have hit the end of our slides. I'm just going to stay back on this one for a second. See if we have any questions. It's now time for questions. We got about 5 minutes. If anybody has any questions.
And there we do. Let me jump in here.
Yeah.
As folks formulate their questions, we've got a couple, but we'd love to see more. We want to draw your attention to the links in the attachments tab in the console here, and invite you to connect with Jerry or anybody else at Nemertes in LinkedIn. Fill out an application to join Nemertes online community. You can see there's also a way to get to it directly on the web, and to register for upcoming episodes in this series, which, as you can see, are listed out here. And with that, we will dive into questions. And again, I'll invite everybody to submit them, because once we get done with the questions we've got, we'll be moving on. And right now we have a couple of good ones. When different teams are responsible for different emerging technologies, how can they best coordinate their plans and roadmaps?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, John. I think communication is key. I got to tell you, regardless of the adoption of various technologies, the biggest problem I find with almost every company when they have any kind of issue, ultimately communication is a big factor. It's the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So having regular periodic meetings with different departments, and whether that be IT, where you're talking security people talking with operations people, if you're talking development people talking with operations people, it's essential for these groups to talk together, because what I find very often when you have an idea and you implement it, it's like that old thing where I tell you a story and you tell somebody else and you tell somebody else. It's like somebody has an idea of something to develop. Then somebody designed something, which is slightly different when the person who wanted it. Then the person who implements it a little bit different than the guy who designed it. And then the person using it is actually using it differently than the person who implemented it. So all of a sudden, a user of the technology is like, hey, I'm using this thing over here and it's not working right. And then you talk to developers like, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. We never designed it to do that. So having these different groups talking together is absolutely essential so that I can understand, get feedback from people on how they're using technologies, get feedback on, people understand how it's being built. They can understand each other more. So I think when you have these different emerging technologies, the fact that people can share what they're doing, what'll happen is one person is going to be, that's in this different domain you described, is going to say something, and it's going to prompt the other person to say, oh, wow, I've got a way I could use that thing I'd never thought about. And the way you're talking about it is giving me an idea. And similar, the other person can do something. So I think it really, truly is an example of 1 + 1 = 3. The different groups, not only are you going to sort out incompatibilities on things like how do I pass information from one technology to another, but then I'm going to get ideas on how I can use your technology in my domain and vice versa. And then that integration will actually make everything better. But it only works if you set up a formal method of actually sharing information. So that's what I would say is communication. Don't assume it's going to happen because I accidentally overheard you on the water cooler on the way to the bathroom, because in today's environment, we may not be seeing the water cooler or the bathroom because we're virtual, right? So you got to formally plan these things and plan for the communication. Just don't hope it happens.
And I'll throw in that we have encountered companies where they had a team whose job was just to look at what the other teams were doing and try and make those connections amongst folks who seem to be working in adjacent or overlapping or complementary fields, and make sure they were coordinating with each other. It's the sort of thing that can help if the number of people in the spread of operations is big enough.
No, that's great. Yeah, another
Thank
question.
You, yep, another question here. And again, folks, if you got something simmering in the back of your head and you haven't asked it yet, now is a good time. Is there still time to define governance properly for each thing we bring on board before it is obsolete?
I guess the short answer to me on that one would be there's no time like the present. So I would say yes. It's you're always better off bringing up something to govern before it's obsolete. And the sooner you bring it up, the better it is. Even if something's been a mature technology, that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to think about how are we going to control and use this thing. So yeah, to me, you should be doing it much sooner than people do. But just because something's been in for 2 or 3 years doesn't mean, oh, well, no need to govern this anymore. It's like doing it at all is, in my opinion, always better than not doing it.
Agreed. And the time to do it is as you're testing, doing proof of concept, getting ready to put it in production. You shouldn't put it into production without some kind of governance in place around it.
And the last thing I would say,
final.
Yeah, and the last thing I'd say about that, John, which is a big error I see a lot of people doing in embracing new technology, is they're not including the users of technology. I see people say, here's this new technology, it's going to do all this great stuff, and I'm basically shoving it at you, whether that's a new email system, whether that's an application for doing credit card fraud detection. I don't care what it is. It's almost like, people are thinking about how the technology works when they're building it, but people are not always thinking about how is somebody going to actually use this technology? How are we going to maintain this technology? And so including, as you're designing the specifications for technology, just don't ask people what I need for functionality. Ask the people who are responsible for maintaining it, how is it that you're going to use it? How are you going to administer it? So I can make sure I take those factors into consideration when I'm implementing the technology as well. Very often I find the users of technology are an afterthought, and they really need to be done at the beginning as you're building the technology in the first place.
Couldn't agree more.
All right.
And
With that,
actually,
go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say that looks like all the questions we have for now.
Great. And I was going to say we've turned into a time pumpkins as well. So thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you for the future episodes. As you can see there, we got another 4 coming every Thursday for the next few weeks. So we look forward to seeing you at future telecasts. Talk to you later. Thanks for coming.